Today's daf is daf Pei Gimel, and let's begin by reviewing the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan that we're going to attack now. Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that if you have a neder that she took, and it has two parts to it. One dimension of the neder is Inu Nefesh, which the Baal could be Mefer, but the other dimension of the neder is not Inu Nefesh. Like, for example, the Shtei Kikros, one was a very good piece, and that's Inu Nefesh, the other she wouldn't eat anyway. So Rabbi Yochanan holds that the Hafar is Chal only vis-a-vis that segment of the neder that's Inu Nefesh. But the other half of the neder is still Chal. She'll get Malchus if she violates it, because the Hafar is not Chal on that half, which is not Inu Nefesh. So the Gemara now raises the following objection here on Daf Pei Gimel. In a case where she took upon herself Nazirus, and the Brisa tells us, actually it's a Mishnah in Nazir, that if she violates her Nazirus, she'll get Malchus. For example, if she drinks wine or she's Metami L'Mesim, and she'll get Malchus not only in a case where there wasn't any Hafara, but even in the case where there was Hafara. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, this would make logical sense that she would get Malchus even if the Baal was Mefer. Why? Because there are two parts to the Iser of Shtias Yayin with regard to Ilchus Nedarim in the case of a Nazir. One part of the Iser Shtias Yayin is the Yayin itself. And abstinence from Yayin is called Inu Nefesh. But included in the Iser of Yayin, the Torah says, is Chartzon and Zad. And these are parts of the grapes that have no element of Inu Nefesh. Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, we should come to the conclusion that she gets Malchus. Why? Because if she eats the Chartzon and the Zag, and she had Asra and so forth, then that part of the neder, even though the Baal was made for the neder of Nazirus, he could only be made for the Yayin part, but not the Chartzon and Zag part, because Chartzon and Zag is not Inu Nefesh. And yet, if we look at the language of the Brisa carefully, the stoma of the Brisa would seem that if the Baal was Mefer HaNazirus, then she doesn't get Malchus at all. Not even for Chartzon and Zag. Now, this would support the opposing Shita of Shmuel against Rabbi Yochanan, who says that once the Baal is Mefer than the Neder, then the entire Neder is batel. It's a kind of Neder Shehuta Miktsasa Huta Kulo. And therefore, since the Baal could be matir his Mefer HaNazirus as far as Yain is concerned, therefore the Hafara will remove the entire Neder Nazirus, even as far as Chartzon and Zag. But we have here a Kasha and Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yosef. So this is where we're up to for today. And if you count down from the top of the Amud, it would be about 7 lines down. Ein Nazirus Lechatzayin. Rabbi Yosef is claiming that there's a separate din in Nazirus. The Torah gave the husband a power to be mefer his wife's Nazirus. And Nazirus can't be chal part way. It's either all or nothing. So if you're going to say that since the Baal doesn't have power to be mefer that part of the Iser Yain, which is called Zag v'Chartzon, that's not Inu Nefesh, then he won't be able to be made for the other half of the neder on Shtias Yain, which is Inu Nefesh, because Ein Nazirus L'Chatzayin, because that would only be operative based on the principles of Rabbi Yochanan if half the neder would be Chal, half the Nazirus, and the other half would not be Chal. And Rabbi Yosef points out that we have a principle that Ein Nazirus L'Chatzayin. So if the Torah guaranteed the husband the right to be made for his wife's Nazirus, it must be that in this particular case, the entire Nazirus would fall apart. Otherwise, if the Nazirus would not fall apart, then it's impossible to validate the husband's hafara, which the Torah did. Now, we're going to see Abaye's comment to Rav Yosef. Now, in order to appreciate this comment of Abaye, we must add the following introduction. Abaye understood from the words of Rav Yosef that a person cannot be makabel on himself a part nazirus, a half nazirus. So if a person accepts upon himself nazirus from shtiyas yayin, but not from achilas zag v'chartza, that nazirus would not be chal. However, the implication of Rabbi Yosef would be, according to Abaye's understanding, that if a person accepted upon himself full-fledged nazirus, the entire package of nazirus, then nazirus could be chal lechatzoin. What would that mean, lechatzoin? We have a principle of nazirus that stam nazirus is shloshim yom. Lechatzoin would be a kabbalas nazirus of 15 days. If Rabbi Yosef held that even a kabbalas nazirus of 15 days would not be valid, then he should have said not ein nazirus lechatzoin, but rather ein chatzoin b'nazirus. Just 1 second, sorry. Actually, I think it's 15 and 20. So Abaye's diuk is Rav Yosef, had he said the words ein chatzoin b'nazirus, he would imply that there's no such thing as an incomplete nazirus. And that would mean two things. Number one, if he was makabel on himself a partial Easter nazirus, and number two, if he was makabel on himself a partial time for nazirus. The timeline for nazirus is 30 days, and if he wants to accept upon himself a timeline of 15 days, for example, then according to Abaye, the nazirus would not be chal. It comes under the principle of ein chatzoin b'nazirus. But Rav Yosef didn't say ein chatzoin b'nazirus. He says ein nazirus lechatzoin, which means that he cannot split and pick and choose which part of the Eastern nazirus he wants to accept upon himself. So Amalei Abaye ha karban lachatzi nazirus ika. Should I be medayik and derived from your words that if a person would accept upon himself nazirus, that would be chal for less than 30 days, then in violating that nazirus, there would be a karban. Or, yeah, and that's going to be in case where the nazir became tummy. We'll see an entire list of karbanos, a whole set, a series of karbanos that a nazir tummy has to bring to the Beis HaMikdash. So Omalei Abaye, again, the diuk of Abaye to Rav Yosef is hakarban lachatzi nazirus ika. Okay, so let's say, for example, in the case of Afara, if we take this issue of ein chatzon l'nazirus, which is Abaye's shita, and put it into the framework of Hafara, it would mean that she took upon herself a nazirus, stam nazirus shloshim yom, and the Baal was made fair after 15 days. Let's say he only found out about the nazirus after she was into the nazirus for 15 days. And Abaye is claiming that if the Baal is made fair after 15 days, then the entire nazirus would fall apart. Because ein chatzon b'nazirus. However, the diuk of Abaye from Rav Yosef is that there's no halach of ein chatzon b'nazirus, and therefore, if she had a full-fledged Nazirus for 15 days, that would be a valid Nazirus, and she would have to bring a carbon for those 15 days of Nazirus in event that she violated Nazirus and became Tmeya. Ella, and therefore, based on this Kash Amar Abaye, Ein Nazirus l'chatzon v'ein carbon l'chatzon. Ein carbon l'chatzon is the same as Ein chatzon v'nazirus, meaning Abaye l'shitaso goes even a step further. That just like the Baal cannot be made for a part of the Nazirus, let's say, for example, only vis-a-vis Yayin, but not vis-a-vis Zag and Chatzon, so too, there's no such thing as Nazirus for less than a full 30 days. That's also Chatzon. And therefore, if the Baal, heard about the Nazirus after 15 days, and then he was made for the Nazirus, she would not bring a carbon at all, even if, let's say, she were to violate her Nazirus during that 15-day period. Now, here we have to ask another question. We know that Hafaras Habal, as opposed to Hataras Chacham, is not Oker the Neder L'Mafreya Mikara. But nevertheless, the Torah only said, bring a carbon for Nazirus Shlema. And even if from now, the day of the Haparan on, her Nazirus terminates, and therefore her Nazirus turns out to be only a 15-day Nazirus, the Torah didn't say that you should bring a carbon for less than a full-fledged Nazirus. And now the Gemara is going to ask a kasha on Abaye from a Brisa, and the Brisa is going to seem to indicate that there is a carbon on Nazirus that's less than 30 days. So Isha Shenadra bin Nazir, she accepted upon herself a full-fledged Nazirus, and then she became Tmeya during the days of Nazirus. She has to bring 3 karbanos. Number 1, an Asham, a Chatos, and an Ola. Now let's point out that the Asham is from a Behema, the Chatos and the Ola from Ophos. So there's a Chatos Ov and an Ola Ov. And that's the halacha of a Nazir Shenitma. The Frisha Behemta, she was Mafresh Behema as a Korban Asham, V'achakach Hefer Lo Baila, Nevia Chatos Ov. Now, for the moment, let's not confuse ourselves and put into brackets, put on the back burners the next part of this brisa that says V'ena Mevia Ola. So forget about that. Make believe it doesn't say that, just for the pedagogical purposes. What it does say is Mevia Chatas Ha'o. Now, the Baal was made for a Nazirus, which means that at some point it's less than a full-fledged Nazirus in terms of the actual fulfillment of the 30 days of Nazirus. And yet, she will have to bring, in event that she became Tmeya, a Chatas Ha'o. The Iyamr, if you're going to say like Abai Ein Korban L'Chatzi Nazirus, Amai Mevia Chatas Ha'o, why does she bring a Chatas Ha'o once the Baal is made for the Neder? And from now on, the Neder is Batel. She should be exempt from Korban because she doesn't have a full-fledged Nazirus, and this is a case of Chatzon b'Nazirus. So now the Gemara says the following. You know what? Even if you don't accept Abaye, the Brisa is still difficult. What are you going to tell me? Yesh Korban L'Chatzi Nazirus against Abaye. That's what you want to conclude based on this Brisa. Then Sholosh Behemoth by Lasil. Why is it that she only brings 1 extra carbon in addition to the carbon that she bought? She should bring 2 extra carbons, totaling 3 carbonos, Chatas, Ola, and Shlamim. In other words, why is it that she only brings a Chatas Ha'of and not an Ola Ha'of? Eliolam, let's go back to Abaye. Ein carbon L'Chatzi Nazirus. There is no carbon if the Baal was made for the middle of the Nazirus. And now the question is, not why she doesn't bring an ola sa'of, but why she does bring a chata sa'of. And that's the question that we had against Abaye. And now the Gemara is going to answer that question by saying chata sa'of mishum the chata sa'asaf. Chata sa'of has a special status in Allah. And that's why she will bring a chata sa'of. Even though it's chatzi nazirus, and there's no korban nazir in chatzi nazirus, nevertheless, she will bring a chata sa'of. Because chata sa'of is bal asafik. So let's say, for example, with regard to all korbanos, if a person is in a situation of a suffix, he does not bring the korban. It's like suffix brachas lahakil. When in doubt, leave it out, because it's a suffix chulul lazar. But in the case of chata sa'of, we have an exception to the rule. And in the case of suffix, we bring a chata sa'of as a korban. And that puts chata sa'of in a separate category. It's called kal, kuf lamed. And because of this div, this status of chata sa'of of kal, she can bring a korban achatzi naziris. But other korbanos, like for example, ola sa'of, she will not bring, or an event that she hadn't brought an asham as a behem as an asham, she will not bring a behem as asham. It's only the case with regard to chata sa'of, which is bal asafik. Now, what case of safek would be chata sa'of? Yoledes, she pilo, she had a miscarriage, and we don't know whether or not she has a chiyuv korban of yoledes or not, because maybe ruachi pila, maybe it was not a viable being, and therefore she's ptura from a korban. She will bring a chata sa'of misafek. And it's only when she brings the chata sa'of misafek that she's allowed to enter into the Beis Hamikdash or eat kodshim. Now the Gemara Nazir on Daf Chav Tes establishes that chatas is not eaten, eino necheles, because it's bal asafek. Now again, what we have to understand is, okay, I understand the chata sa'of is bal asafek, but here there's no nazirus to generate a korban. So what is it? And I was thinking that maybe it could be a korban in dava, but there's no such thing as a chatas above in dava. But let me just take a second of time. I didn't get a chance to look in the Yalkut HaBi'urim. Perhaps I could find something quickly here. I won't delay it too long. Let's just see. Oh, he says here the following. Eliolam ein korban lechatzi nazirus v'chatzi of demasya mishum dechatos ala safek. Bia rishon v'kavanas hagmar shekevit shenischadesh kula v'chatos of she'efshal avia af ala safek u'ba'ofen zeh hi eina necheles af al pichin ein b'chashash chulun b'azara. In Kain Anu Rom she'efshal akriv korban zeh afilu ba'ofen she'eino korban gomer v'yesh bo tzad chulun. In Kain kvoche nitan lahavi chatas of af al chatzi nazirus. No, he's not answering our question. Very disappointing. Oh, now I see a little bit of an answer. He quotes the Rosh based on a Sugya Nazir test that this brisa reflects the unique shita of Rabbi Eliezer HaKapor, shenazir nikra chote be'etzem kabbalas hanazirus. Ki al yodo hu mitztayr min hayayin v'choshev avera. Wow. This is the famous avera, the answer to the question why a nazir brings a korban chata shehi shetzir atzmo min hayayin. L'chein tzarech korban l'chatas al cheto mishum kach af shehefer l'bayla, which I'm going to add, and therefore the nazirus is not chal. Chayeves bavos chatas ha'of kidei l'chaper al achat shetzir atzmo min hayayin. Very nice. Okay. That was Kedai. Okay, now the Gemara comes back to ask a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. Esvei ha'isha shenodra b'nazir b'nitmeis v'achri kach hefer l'bayla mevia chatas ha'of ve'en mevia olas ha'of. So again, chatas ha'of we said is a special din. She will not bring olas ha'of. And the reason for that is because it's a Nazirus of less than 30 days once the Baal was made for her Nazirus. Frek the Gemara, Kash on Rabbi Yochanan, the E, Amrit, Mefer l'mis'aneh, the Ein Mefer l'shein mis'aneh. According to Rabbi Yochanan, that he can only be Mefer, the Baal. The Yayin part, but not the Chartz and V'adzag, because that is Eno Mis'ana, it's not Inu Nefesh. And here we turn to Daf Hey Gimel and Beis.